early hours of a warm summer's morning on Sunday the 31st of August 1997, in the world's most romantic city, Paris, Diana, the Princess of Wales, tragically died in a horrific car crash. She was 36 years old. A family mourned, a nation wept. It seemed that the heart of the world stopped. Born at Park House, Sandringham on July the 1st, 1961, Diana Frances Spencer was the third daughter of one of Britain's most historic families. Her birth is reported to have been greeted with disappointment by her father, who had longed for a boy. Her parents divorced when she was only 6. It was a lonely childhood, and one she later vowed her own children would never endure.
The Spencer household was not a happy one, and Di's childhood memories were often tearful. She would sit at the foot of the stairs with her 2 elder sisters, their hands cupped over their ears as their parents argued, and eventually she saw her mother walk from the front door of the Spencer home forever. The family witnessed an acrimonious divorce, and later Earl Spencer's remarriage to his second wife, Rain. The children adored their father, but hated their new stepmother, and that lasted until very recent times.
Having 2 parents at war does have a very traumatic effect on a child, and Diana was a particularly sensitive little girl. And I think it was an effect that would last with her through adult life, because even though when parents split up they take great pains to say to a child, well, Mum and Daddy still love you, the child still feels rejected and unloved, and they somehow blame themselves for why their parents are no longer with them. And of course Diana and her brother and other two sisters were bounced between one parent and another. And maybe this kind of very insecure childhood stayed with Diana through all her life and had a very, very long-lasting effect. And it probably does explain an awful lot of Diana's continued feeling to want to be loved by people and to give a lot of love, because it was, I think, a throwback to this awfully sad childhood.
Diana went to boarding school in West Heath in Kent. She was not an academic girl, but excelled at sport. After a spell at a Swiss finishing school, at 17 she came back to London to look for work.
Diana was obviously a lovely girl, but she wasn't, to be fair, really equipped for any kind of high-powered career when she sort of left her varying nannying jobs and she left home. So I suppose because of her upbringing, the natural path to follow was working with children. Because of her own upsets and trauma, Diana had a very big insight into the mind of a child. She'd be the first one to pick out a child who looked lonely or unhappy. She'd be the first one to take a child's hand, and indeed children would follow her. She was at one time called the Pied Piper, and children would naturally go towards Diana. I think an interesting story is the fact that when she went to a friend's sports day, all the little girls won prizes except this one particular little child, and Diana noticed it and went over, and she created her own little ribbon and gave it to the little girl. And I think that's a very sort of telling insight into Diana's mind, that working with children, her love with children, and a love that later came out with her own sons, it was just inevitable, I think. For all her sort of rather grand social background, Diana was never a debutante. Maybe this is because her mother wasn't around to sort of push her forward and do the grand coming out. So Diana led a very ordinary life when she was a young girl and a teenager. She moved to London. She shared a flat with a few good friends, which is what all young girls like to do. She was, in fact, very much a Sloane. But she was never sort of like above herself. She'd help out with ironing with friends, and in fact there's stories where she'd sort of do boyfriends' ironings and washing for them. So she stayed a very ordinary girl, and she did the ordinary things like shopping in Knightsbridge and things like that. But of course, one has to remember that she did come from quite a good background, and as the events were later to tell, this would actually sort of lead to her jumping over the garden fence and mixing with the little boy who was one day to become her husband.
The Spencer and Windsor families had always been very close. Earl Spencer had been equerry to the Queen's father, George VI. And for their early years, the Spencers had lived on the Queen's Sandringham estate. So it was not unusual for the Queen to pop in for a cup of tea. Neither was it unusual when they moved to Althorp Hall in Northamptonshire for Prince Charles to drop by. In fact, he dropped by for a pheasant shoot. But bagging pheasants wasn't everything that was on his mind.
Press rumours started to spread about the growing relationship between Charles and the young Diana Spencer.
It was a full year before Charles and Diana met again. By now, the rather awkward, chubby little girl had moved to London and had become an attractive young woman. She was 17. She was not on the debutante circuit. She shunned the London high life, but was nevertheless known to Charles from his childhood days. He sought her out again. He had her and her family invited to the Queen's Balmoral estates in Scotland for a house party. The invitations continued, but from that moment onwards, the invitations were to Diana alone, not to the entire family, and that's how the romance flourished.
In 1980, Charles travelled to Zimbabwe for the independence ceremony and subsequent celebrations. Camilla Shand, now Parker Bowles, travelled as his official escort. Charles returned to woo the young Diana Spencer. Their romance became common knowledge that summer until their engagement was announced in February 1981, with Diana sporting a beautiful £28,000 diamond and sapphire engagement ring.
It was not a normal courtship by any modern standards. On the one hand, Prince Charles was under pressure to find a bride, from his parents particularly, because they were anxious to see him married.
He'd been told it was time to settle down and start having children.
When Prince Charles decided he was going to marry Diana, the person who gave him her unqualified support and, in a way, permission was Camilla.
Even way back when Charles and Diana had just got engaged and the marriage was announced and the wedding presents started to come in, Princess Diana was absolutely devastated to find a package in Charles's private quarters which she thought was a wedding present to them both. And when she opened it, She found out, in fact, it was a present from Camilla, a private present, a personal present from Camilla to Charles. And I think then she perhaps got an inkling that she's up against a very difficult battle, that there was one woman who would always be in the shadow of their marriage.
They were married in July 1981, and to begin with, they were clearly happy. True, Charles may not have been the most conventional of romantic husbands, but the newlyweds were obviously in love, and it was only gradually to become clear that Charles would be upstaged by his beautiful wife. Diana became pregnant almost immediately. Prince William was born in June the next year, and it wasn't too long after the birth of William that commentators noticed that Diana was looking painfully thin. Charles's lack of rapport with his young wife became increasingly apparent. In 1982, Charles arrived for the Remembrance Day ceremony at the Royal Albert Hall alone, saying his wife was not well. Yet 5 minutes later, Diana arrived. Things went from bad to worse, with claims of suicide attempts.
Many things went wrong in the marriage. First of all, he fell out of love with her, or, as he'd never been in love with her, love evaporated.
They didn't like each other. It was quite clear they didn't like each other. There was no affection. They weren't tactile. There was no more touching. There were no more affectionate pats on the bottom from him to her. And they would arrive at places and split. And their backs to each other. And he, of course, felt this very strongly because he knew that she was upstaging him all the time.
The birth of their second child, Prince Harry, in 1984, kept up the pretense that all was well. In public, they mastered the art of putting on a united front, but behind the facade, things continued to deteriorate. Diana felt a stranger in her own home. In 1986, on a tour of Canada, proof positive emerged that the marriage was effectively over. In Vancouver, attending the Expo World Fair, the princess, clearly suffering from the effects of her bulimia, fainted in public.
Charles didn't rush to her side. He told her to pull herself together and to make herself presentable for that evening's festivities. Charles's utter frustration with his sham marriage came about 5 years into it. At that time, he'd given up the one love of his life, Camilla. He'd stayed with Diana for those 5 years. After 5 years, he went back to Camilla. She became his comfort, his shoulder to cry on. I think it's significant that whenever Princess Diana visited Highgrove after an absence when Charles had been there, she would walk straight over to the telephone and press the redial button. At the end of the line was the Parker Bowles household on every occasion.
The abiding images of royalty in the late 80s are frivolous ones. On the ski slopes, at Ascot, at work and at play, the youngsters could be seen to be having a good time. But behind those frivolous images, the reality was very different. Diana has blamed the friendship of Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles for contributing to her unhappiness, but many royal watchers think that is not entirely fair. Diana herself was soon to reach a turning point in her life on a skiing trip with Charles to Cloisters. After a photo call, she decided not to continue skiing, a decision which may have saved her life. Within hours, a close friend was dead and another critically injured.
Diana was friends with the wife. It was much more of a personal involvement for Charles and Diana. She was, of course, broken up by the tragedy because she saw a friend of hers who was pregnant losing her husband. And on that very same holiday, Catherine Soames had run off with another man who had been married 4 times. So there were other ramifications of the Cloisters holidays which we've never gone into, which gave Diana also food for thought and for feeling that perhaps life was very unfair.
By the end of the 1980s, Charles and Diana were virtually living separate lives. It was only a matter of time before something dramatic occurred. What was remarkable was the nature of the event and how it came to the attention of the public. The effects were staggering and contributed to the crisis that was already facing the House of Windsor.
The Princess of Wales was spending the New Year holiday, 1989-1990, at Sandringham with her children, her husband, and the rest of the senior royals. And she did what it appeared was her habit of an evening. She got on the phone.
The Diana Gate tapes, I believe, in fact, I am certain, were the work of a very deep and sinister dirty tricks department. Nothing will ever persuade me that these tapes came out by accident. I believe the people who did reveal them didn't really know what it was all about.
In 1990, the rift between Charles and Diana was highlighted when he fell off a horse playing polo. The princess was in London when the news reached her that he had broken his arm in 2 places. Diana was in a quandary. She knew she should rush to his side, but it is reported she couldn't be bothered. They were now openly unhappy together, and they chose to spend most of their time apart.
The time Charles had his polo accident, Diana had had time to take stock of the marriage, and she'd gone through a very, very bad period with Charles.
The royal family weren't very much help to Prince Charles in his time of agony and the breakdown of his marriage. His father certainly might have taken some enjoyment from it. His mother was unable to help simply because Charles never asked her.
I primarily blame Charles for not entering the marriage in a modern, acceptable way and not giving his princess the full scope that she should have had in the early years, and reaching a stage where she became not just a competitor, but then an adversary. And really, it was his fault.
Charles is so staid, such a young old fogey set in his ways, that Diana found herself totally reliant on her own devices, on her own friends. She couldn't hold a serious conversation with Charles or his friends. They're all intellectuals.
The Business of Atlam Morton book is fascinating, because I don't believe that Andrew, whom I know well, ever set out to write that book. I think he set out with the dream of writing a different kind of book, and suddenly all this material was given to him by acquiescence of those that have now been named as sources, and certainly they would never have done so without the princess's tacit approval.
Did Diana really attempt suicide? Did she try to kill herself 4 or 5 times, as sometimes been claimed? I think not.
The royal family, the firm, were in a total state of shock. In all its history, it had never had to cope with the public humiliation it was enduring through the clever press manipulation by Diana. It was time to do a deal. After their separation announcement, Charles and Diana had hoped that the pressure on them would ease. It did not. And the most explosive bombshell to hit the royal family was yet to come. His name was James Hewitt. Hewitt had been introduced to Diana at a dinner party in 1985, and sometime shortly after that, they became lovers.
The affair was only fully revealed in the autumn of 1994, when a book was written about Hewitt, largely discredited and certainly disbelieved by Diana's close friends and supporters. But it was true. Diana had had a love affair with James Hewitt, James who shortly afterwards became known as the Cad Hewitt, and she was forced to confess that in an hour-long television special in 1995, and this is what she said. The interviewer asked her, "Did your relationship go beyond a close friendship?" Diana: "Yes, it did, yes." "Were you unfaithful?" And Diana said of Hewitt, "Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him, but I was very let down." And indeed she was.
James Hewitt, the soldier who thought he was brought in as a family riding instructor, soon came to believe that he could aspire to become the Prince Charming to an emotionally unawakened sleeping princess.
I think if you look at James Hewitt, he's what us British would call sort of the chinless wonder, very much an army wimp of a man. There's no doubting he loved her and Diana loved him. I don't think it was actually a very sort of intellectual relationship. It was a physical one. She was a very lonely woman looking for something. But I think James Hewitt obviously is another one who betrayed her trust. He liaised with Anna Pasmak to write the book Princess in Love, which, although it came across as a romantic novel, and everybody sneered at it at the time, saying, "What a lot of rubbish, how could this have happened, how could wonderful Diana have sullied herself?" But of course, it was proved right a couple of years later, when in fact when Diana said, "Yes, we had the affair," and in more interviews with James Hewitt, it did become clear that a lot of this fictional book, as it was in fact true. She did in fact lead him by the hand and take him to bed. which I think was sort of quite remarkable, and I think it probably shows another side to Diana as well.
Diana's frank confession on television of an adulterous affair with James Hewitt and her further criticisms of the House of Windsor in the same interview was seen by many royal observers as a declaration of war by her on the whole royal family. It was therefore no surprise when the Queen, who was in despair at the unprecedented damage being done to the monarchy, soon after ordered the divorce of Charles and Diana. For months, speculation was rife about the nature of the settlement, but whatever was agreed was clearly a decision fought to a bitter conclusion between just the two key players. Diana had agreed to a divorce.
The British public were pleased to learn that Diana had fought for and won a £17 million divorce settlement for Charles, but they were horrified that she'd had to suffer the humiliation of being stripped of her title, Her Royal Highness. From now on, Diana was to be known simply as Diana, Princess of Wales, and public sympathy and love flowed out for her in that difficult time.
At last, she felt free and appeared determined to create a new life for herself.
This was like a new beginning, a new dawn for Diana. She strove to establish herself as an international stateswoman, an ambassador for Britain, she called it, a queen of people's hearts. She got precious little help from the palace and even less from the royal courtiers.
As Diana's brother was to very pointedly say at her funeral, Diana needed no royal title to weave her magic. She became a rather self-appointed ambassador for Britain, but I think looking back, that was such the wisest choice she could have made. People still loved her, and I think she was loved more than anywhere else in America. People still paid thousands of dollars just to not only sit by her side, but attend the very same function that Diana was attending. I'm not talking about small informal gatherings where they had the chance to speak to her, but vast, vast gatherings where people just wanted to be in her presence, so that it was an amazing aura she had. I think one can understand why perhaps Diana was seriously thinking about settling in America, because she was faultless there. People didn't criticize her. They loved her for what she was. She was completely blameless. And I think you can understand her wanting to be in an environment where they thought perhaps, this is the girl for us, we love her. She can only continue to weave her magic for us.
Diana was also determined to fill her life with her charity work. It seemed to be her release, her way of filling her life. She decided to give her love, for it must have seemed that receiving it was forever going to elude her.
Diana threw herself wholeheartedly into her charity work, sometimes publicly, but more often in private, often secretly, often at night. She would visit hospitals and hold the hands of dying cancer patients. She'd visit hospices. She even took her sons, William and Harry, to a hostel for the homeless one night, secretly, without publicity.
From the moment that she cuddled an AIDS victim and the moment that she held a leper's hand, Diane became very much a leading light in charity work. She was like a breath of fresh air, really, because the royal family up until that point had never really been involved in tactile. They never actually cuddled people who were sick. They might go visit them, but never sat on their bedside. And I think this was sort of quite a new dimension. This is probably why people took Diana to their hearts and why she was called Queen of Hearts. She touched people both physically and mentally. And of course, with the charity she moved on to in later life, like a higher profile with AIDS, the Red Cross, the Bosnian landmines. She didn't just talk about going to see these people. She didn't talk about raising money. She went there and she spoke to them. She tried to get into their minds about how it felt to be hurt or sick and suffering. And I think, although people talk about it being wrong to canonize Diana after her death, I think for those that she actually did speak to and get into the minds of them and feel their suffering, it's going to be very difficult to say, well, perhaps she wasn't a saint.
Diana's own unhappy childhood, and in part the formality of her upbringing, influenced her in how she wanted to raise her own two sons. She was determined not to let them fall under the stuffy spell of the royal family, the senior courtiers, and she wept often when she had to allow them to go and spend holidays at the formal HQ of the royal family, Buckingham Palace, or even in the wet and damp of dismal old Balmoral, Scotland.
I think there are two very crucial reasons why Diana brought her boys up in the way that she did. Firstly, And I think one has to remember that no matter what other role a woman has in life, being a mother is the most instinctive role you can have. And I think, bearing in mind her own childhood where she felt rejected and unloved, the priority was to make those boys feel loved every step of the way, even when she wasn't always around, when her and her husband split. She wanted them to always feel loved. She wanted to cuddle them. She wanted to know they were always there. She was always there for them. And of course, she also wanted to knock some of the stuffiness out of the royal family. She was very aware that the boys, particularly William, had a very, very important role to fulfil, which is obviously to one day be King of England. But she didn't want them to be brought up in this stuffy environment. She wanted them to go to McDonald's. She wanted them to laugh. She wanted them to sort of wear the baseball caps, to go ordinarily shopping with other kids and stuff. And I think, like I say, although she knew that one day maybe the boys would be taken away from her and sort of kind of smothered a little bit by the royal family when the day came, that the instinctive role was to love them as a mother can only love her children, and that was always uppermost in her mind.
Diana was determined to get involved in charities that were not glossy. Her early involvement in HIV and AIDS charities is now recognised as changing a nation's perception of the disease. And it was Diana's work with children's charities that gave us such memorable images. She had time for everybody and lit up a room when she entered it. She gave her full backing to the plight of landmine sufferers, travelling to Angola and Bosnia to see for herself the devastation landmines cause. She was a guiding light to all the charities she supported.
Another of Diana's main concerns, of course, was to protect the children, and she's always aware that some damning press report might come out which would hurt them. So she'd always, if a particular damning report was due, she'd go down to see William at school and say, William, this is the situation. Please don't believe what you're going to read. Mummy and Daddy do still love you. Whatever is said in the papers will always be here for you. Don't believe these lies. And an interesting fact was that as William grew older, the role seemed to reverse somewhat, and Diana was no longer the one that supported him. He became a shoulder to cry on. He actually became very grown up, and he would sort of advise his own mother on how to sort of deal with the press, how to be a little bit stronger. And I'm sure that many times he'd sort of say, Mummy, please don't cry. We love you very much. You know, be strong for us, and I'll always be there for you.
Diana's immersion in her charity work and her devotion to her two sons was almost overshadowed by her love-hate relationship with the world's press, especially the paparazzi.
Diana knew very well how to manipulate the press to her own advantage and to the advantage of her charities. But it was a two-way thing. She couldn't take the pressure of the constant attention, which after all had been upon her since she was just 17 or 18 years of age. And eventually it became all too much. She would often be photographed running tearful away from the cameras, not smiling at them. Di felt herself at a disadvantage with the paparazzi. The rest of the royals could hide themselves away on their royal estates and in their castles. But Diana was Diana the Hunted.
I don't think anybody to this very day will ever understand the relationship that Diana had with the press, nor indeed the press with Diana. From those very early images of Diana, a very shy Sloane walking down the street being pursued before she'd even got engaged to Charles, when the rumours were just there. And then there were years and years and years of just constant under the focus of the press. And I think she had to, every day was this tremendous pressure. Do you remember that awful incident where we had secret cams in the gym where she went? So not only was she sort of not allowed to be a public figure, she wasn't really ever allowed to be a private figure. And you heard horrendous stories of paparazzi who would crawl on stomachs to get under windows. There was this great network of wherever she went on the plane, somebody would be tipped off. Every private visit to a doctor, somebody would be tipped off, somebody would be waiting there. And I think it must have taken its toll. I'm very surprised that she wasn't completely unhinged by it, because to have that amount of pressure would not do anybody any good, no matter how gorgeous Diana always looked for the cameras.
With the continual hounding by the press, it was only a matter of time before the world would discover that Diana had possibly, at long last, finally found love.
She was photographed in August 1997 in the south of France with Dodi Fayed, the film producer's son of Mohammed Al Fayed, owner of London store Harrods.
Was Dodi the key to Diana's everlasting happiness? Sadly, we'll never know. But all the signs were there. The two were very, very close. And in fact, they'd known each other a lot longer than the press would lead us to believe. Diana was introducing Dodi as her boyfriend, several months before the press latched onto it. And they were very tactile, they were very loving, very cuddling, and perhaps that's what Diana missed and that's what she wanted. And there were the private gestures. Dodi bought her a beautiful ring as a symbol of his love, and found under Diana's pillow was a poem that Dodi had written her. So, as I said, all the signs were there. Sadly, we'll never know, but it did look like these two young people had found long-lasting and deep love.
She was making no secret of the fact that she was at last in love. In the early hours of Sunday, August the 31st, 1997, Diana and Dodi, having dined at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, stepped into the back of a Mercedes and were driven at high speed to Dodi's Paris home. The Mercedes swept into an underpass beside the River Seine and lost control. The driver and Dodi died instantly. A 3-hour operation ensued in a Paris hospital, a battle for Diana's life. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, the doctors announced that they had failed. Within minutes, the news wires around the world were running red hot with the news that nobody could have predicted and no one wanted to believe.
The style of mourning was phenomenal. People came in droves to London to stand outside Diana's home and Buckingham Palace and to cry for the princess that they loved. And I think that it was interesting that because Diana was very much the people's princess, those people reacted in the way that she would have expected, from the heart. The tears were real. They weren't ashamed to show their emotion. And it'll also go down in history as the day that Diana's people actually changed the course of monarchy and their expression of grief. Because it was because of the public outcry and the demands that the royal family felt obliged to actually come out in the open and speak about their feelings for Diana. Never before, and that speech that the Queen made really will go down in history when she spoke about Diana being a gifted person. I mean, to hear the Queen talk so personally and to express an opinion is unprecedented. And I think it was the day that the monarchy bowed to public pressure. They even had to bring down the flags to half-mast, which they hadn't done before. There's no better way for people to express their feeling of loss for Diana than the expression of flowers. Because wherever Diana had been on her walkabouts, little children would give her bouquets, old people would give her bouquets, and she sometimes would give children flowers back. So I think it's a fairly obvious way that people would lay flowers at her home in Kensington. And at some time, there was up to 1 million bouquets laid at those gates. That's more than 1 million goodbyes in the way that only the people felt that they could do so. And I think, had Diana been looking down, she'd been more than touched at this gesture.
There was a spontaneous outpouring of grief by the British public, and then of anger, at first directed against the paparazzi who, again, had been pursuing Diana that night, the night of her death. Then against the driver of the car, who, it appeared, had been drinking. And finally, and astonishingly, against the royal family themselves, against the senior members, against the Queen. The British public felt that the Queen had not adequately shown her own grief. The family was tucked away safely in Balmoral. Charles had come to London. His sons had come to London to see their mother's body, but the Queen had not. And it was a critical moment for the House of Windsor. Eventually, the public won. The Queen, Prince Philip, and the rest of the royals did come down, and the flag was at last flown at half-mast on top of Buckingham Palace.
On the stroke of 9, 6 horses and soldiers from the King's Troop and the Welsh Guards walked into the gaze of over 2 billion people worldwide. And in London, over 2 million people had come to say goodbye to their princess. When the funeral cortege reached St. James's Palace, it was joined by the Princes William and Harry and Diana's brother Charles, who had taken such an active role in the planning of the day. Behind them walked 500 charity workers. The service at Westminster Abbey was attended by 1,800 of Diana's friends. Celebrities, charity workers and heads of state all came together. Her brother wanted it to be a family funeral to be shared by the people.
Tribute now from Earl Spencer.
I stand before you today, the representative of a family in grief, in a country in mourning, before a world in shock. We are all united, not only in our desire to pay our respects to Diana, but rather in our need to do so. For such was her extraordinary appeal, that the tens of millions of people taking part in this service all over the world, via television and radio, who never actually met her, feel that they too lost someone close to them in the early hours of Sunday morning. It is a more remarkable tribute to Diana than I can ever hope to offer her today. Diana was the very essence of compassion, of duty, of style, of beauty. All over the world, she was a symbol of selfless humanity, a standard-bearer for the rights of the truly downtrodden, a very British girl who transcended nationality, someone with a natural nobility who was classless, and who proved in the last year that she needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic. Today is our chance to say thank you for the way you brightened our lives, even though God granted you but half a life. We will all feel cheated, always, that you were taken from us so young, and yet we must learn to be grateful that you came along at all. Only now you are gone do we truly appreciate what we are now without, and we want you to know that life without you is very, very difficult. We have all despaired at our loss over the past week, and only the strength of the message you gave us through your years of giving has afforded us the strength to move forward. There is a temptation to rush to canonize your memory. There is no need to do so. You stand tall enough as a human being of unique qualities, not need to be seen as a saint. Indeed, to sanctify your memory would be to miss out on the very core of your being, your wonderfully mischievous sense of humor with a laugh that bent you double, your joy for life transmitted wherever you took your smile, and the sparkle in those unforgettable eyes, your boundless energy which you could barely contain. But your greatest gift was your intuition, and it was a gift you used wisely. This is what underpinned all your other wonderful attributes. And if we look to analyze what it was about you that had such a wide appeal, we find it in your instinctive feel for what was really important in all our lives. Without your God-given sensitivity, we would be immersed in greater ignorance at the anguish of AIDS and HIV sufferers, the plight of the homeless, the isolation of lepers, the random destruction of landmines. Diana explained to me once that it was her innermost feelings of suffering that made it possible for her to connect with her constituency of the rejected. And here we come to another truth about her. For all the status, the glamour, the applause, Diana remained throughout a very insecure person at heart, almost childlike in her desire to do good for others so she could release herself from deep feelings of unworthiness, of which her eating disorders were merely a symptom. The world sensed this part of her character and cherished her for her vulnerability, whilst admiring her for her honesty. The last time I saw Diana was on July the 1st, her birthday in London, when typically she was not taking time to celebrate her special day with friends, but was guest of honor at a fundraising charity evening. She sparkled, of course. But I would rather cherish the days I spent with her in March, when she came to visit me and my children in our home in South Africa. I am proud of the fact that, apart from when she was on public display meeting President Mandela, we managed to contrive to stop the ever-present paparazzi from getting a single picture of her. That meant a lot to her. These were days I will always treasure. It was as if we had been transported back to our childhood, when we spent such an enormous amount of time together, the two youngest in the family. Fundamentally, she hadn't changed at all, from the big sister who mothered me as a baby, fought with me at school, and endured those long train journeys between our parents' homes with me at weekends. It is a tribute to her level-headedness and strength that despite the most bizarre life imaginable after her childhood, she remained intact, true to herself. There is no doubt that she was looking for a new direction in her life at this time. She talked endlessly of getting away from England, mainly because of the treatment that she received at the hands of the newspapers. I don't think she ever understood why her genuinely good intentions were sneered at by the media, why there appeared to be a permanent quest on their behalf to bring her down. It is baffling. My own and only explanation is that genuine goodness is threatening to those at the opposite end of the moral spectrum. It is a point to remember that of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age. She would want us today to pledge ourselves to protecting her beloved boys, William and Harry, from a similar fate. And I do this here, Diana, on your behalf. We will not allow them to suffer the anguish that used regularly to drive you to tearful despair. And beyond that, on behalf of your mother and sisters, I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these two exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you plan. We fully respect the heritage into which they have both been born, and will always respect and encourage them in their royal role. But we, like you, recognize the need for them to experience as many different aspects of life as possible, to arm them spiritually and emotionally for the years ahead. I know you would have expected nothing less from us. William and Harry, we all care desperately for you today. We're all chewed up with sadness at the loss of a woman who wasn't even our mother. How great your suffering is, we cannot even imagine. I would like to end by thanking God for the small mercies he's shown us at this dreadful time, for taking Diana at her most beautiful and radiant, and when she had joy in her private life. Above all, we give thanks for the life of a woman I'm so proud to be able to call my sister. The unique, the complex, the extraordinary and irreplaceable Diana, whose beauty, both internal and external, will never be extinguished from our minds.
From London, the cortege moved to the Spencer ancestral home, Althorp House, 77 miles away in the county of Northamptonshire. Diana was buried later that day on a beautiful island in the middle of an ornamental lake. It was her father's favourite spot.
The world will never see a funeral like that. Every person, I think, that had a TV was tuned in that day. Strangers wept openly in the streets. And I think, in an unprecedented act, as Diana's hearse made its way back to her resting place in Northamptonshire, the amount of flowers strewn in the path was just, I think, an unforgettable sight. It's never been known before. And also the fact that people cheered, which some might have thought was rather disrespectful. In fact, it was probably the greatest respect that they could pay. People actually applauded in the church. They applauded Diana's coffin. And I think that was to show love. and it really will go down in history as the day that the world tuned in and said goodbye to the Queen of Hearts.
Prince William and his brother, Prince Harry, had the eyes of the world focused upon them at the funeral of their mother, and they acquitted themselves magnificently. The boy born to be king had, in the eyes of the British public and in the eyes of the world, become an adult almost overnight.
I think one had to ask what legacy Diana left behind. It would be summed up in one word: love. The love she felt for her sons, the love she felt for the people she came in contact with, and particularly the love she felt for those who were suffering and lonely and hurt and in pain. That'll always stay with us. And if the one good thing can come out of it, it must be that hopefully we can carry on her work and the feeling she left behind us. Maybe the charity that she worked for will still benefit, even though she's no longer with us. And maybe the boys will always remember the work she did, and they will carry it on, and they'll always remember the words of wisdom she spoke to them. And hopefully the monarchy will follow in her path too, and they will take some of the stuffiness away and become real people. And I think that's what Diana would have wanted, and it is indeed a big legacy to leave behind.
Now William, as handsome a Prince Charming as his mother was a fairy tale princess, is being groomed to assume the ultimate role as head of the British royal family and to shape their destiny. And that is Princess Diana's ultimate legacy.